my pleasure to introduce my colleague and the author of the newest version of the DataWise book. It's the third edition that just came out. Candice Bocala has been at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in multiple capacities. If you've ever done a DataWise Institute, you've had the opportunity to learn from her. Um, but she's going to share with us today just a little bit about how she thinks about some of these principles at scale. So, Candice, please take it away.
All right, thank you, and hi, everybody. So as was mentioned, I only have a little bit of time to share some ideas with you, and then for the rest of this time, you'll be making sense of them, and I hope that you'll have a chance to continue to think and talk about them even after our session today. So in System-Wise, the big ideas of data literacy, many of them are captured in this appendix at the end of System-Wise. And I know this is quite small. You're not able to read it here, but this is one of the tools that we're going to be giving you as a result of you joining us today. There are some really useful questions to ask as you think about who do we want to assess or measure, and what are we going to ask them, right? How are we going to measure the thing that they're telling us about? What kinds of data are we using? And then what do we make of the results? And so at each step of this process, one of the most important things is to teach people some terms that can help them assess whether or not their inferences are really supporting the kinds of conclusions they want to draw, whether the data support those inferences, and when they might need some more data because the data might be incomplete for a particular reason. And so one of the things we have found in our work in both DataWise and System-Wise is teaching people some helpful vocabulary to be able to talk about the data, which we call data literacy. Another skill that's really important is just even understanding what it is I am going to look at. So in a moment, I'm going to show you some displays. And what we use in the DataWise book is what we call this scavenger hunt template. The scavenger hunt template is intended to walk a viewer or a reader through the data display and help them identify some of the most important characteristics before they even start drawing conclusions about what they're seeing. So sometimes you put a data display in front of people and they start to say, oh, we did really bad on this assessment, or as a district, we're really falling behind. But do we even know what it is we're looking at? Have we sort of oriented to what year, for example, was this assessment given? Are there comparisons over time? Who are these data about? And so this data literacy scavenger hunt, we find, even though it seems self-explanatory, is a really useful tool to use when just sitting down and going through a score report or a data report for the very first time. And this is another one of those resources that you'll be able to have as a result of attending our session today. And I just want to model a little bit of what this looks like. So these are the assessment results from a real school district here in Massachusetts. This is Malden, Massachusetts. It's a sort of urban fringe city/suburb that is on right just outside of Boston. And so as you look at this, you just automatically start looking at those really, really cool colors. But one of the things that's important here is just to even know, what am I looking at? What is the name of this assessment tool? It's the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System. What we in Massachusetts use is our state assessment, or the MCAS. And then you can start to see these other questions will guide you through what areas or domains are covered. I can see English language arts as well as mathematics. Whom are the data about? How many people are represented? I'm looking at third grade for both of these assessments. We had a 100% participation rate in all of those cases. So it was 100% of the students in third grade in Malden. How were the data collected? That I don't have a lot of other assumptions other than to know that this was the state test. Why were they collected? Presumably for the purposes of accountability. And in what format are the results reported? We actually don't have a lot of information about that either, but we do see that it is by achievement level. So that means exceeding expectations, meeting expectations, et cetera. So it can lead me to wonder, if I don't see something on this particular score report, I might need some more data to try to help me dig more deeply into what the question is that I am trying to ask in this case. So again, just orienting ourselves to looking at data reports, getting everybody on the same page is a really useful activity when you start to look at data. But I really want to spend the most time here going back to what I said before, which was helping people learn some useful vocabulary about the data they're about to discuss. So in our work, in both data-wise and system-wise, we use a few data literacy terms. I will say that these data literacy terms are more common in terms of describing the results of an assessment that is more of a standardized assessment. So we know that you use a lot of different forms of data, including data from school climate surveys, data from interviews with teachers, perhaps with students. And so sometimes the kinds of terms we use here may not apply. But we know that you all spend a lot of time looking at assessment results from some kind of standardized assessment. And so we use the following terms in our work. The first one is reliability. Reliability describes a measure. So if you replicated this assessment, we're looking at this question of how variable would the scores or responses be. For measurement error, we would be thinking about the discrepancy between something that is observed or measured and what we would call the learner's true performance, whatever that means. The true is in quotes because, sometimes it's hard to know what is true, but this idea that we might not have captured everything the learner knows or can do or how they feel, then we have measurement error. So I might ask myself the question, what inconsistencies might arise when I am administering this assessment that might lead to some measurement error? For validity, we talk about this as describing the property of an inference. We would never say that assessments in and of themselves are valid or not valid. In fact, what we would say is my inference is valid or not valid, depending upon the purpose of the assessment and what I am trying to conclude. So when I think about validity, I think about, does this evidence convince me that my inferences are well supported? For a sample, this describes how the items from the test or the people in my survey were selected. So when I take a portion out of a larger group, that is called a sample. And so I ask myself, how well does the smaller group of items represent the domain of interest or whatever it is that I am trying to measure? And finally, again, back to this world of assessments, we have this term score inflation, which is a phenomenon that happens when there are incentives to game the system. So we ask ourselves, does an improvement in scores indicate an improvement in student mastery of the domain? Or is it possible that those scores are actually inflated because there was some kind of incentive, maybe a high stakes test or incentives given to educators to perform in a certain way, that actually can be grounds for score inflation. So we always want to be cautious as we think about, are these score increases actually due to increases in student learning? And so using these terms, again, typically when we're talking about how our students are doing on assessments, can be really useful as we think about what we know from these assessments and what we don't know from these assessments. Oftentimes, the answer is usually we can't assume or know everything from a single set of assessments. And so we want to get more data. So I would love to just practice again with that data display that I gave you before, which was about the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System for the third grade in Malden, Massachusetts. What concerns might you have about reliability or measurement error, sample or score inflation on an assessment like this if you were reading this score report as a district or central office or system leader? And what other information might you need to draw more valid inferences from this assessment? So I wanted to just step back and also put into context that some of these terms are more or less applicable when you're working with standardized assessments at scale, when you're looking across a system, for example, at assessment scores that have been normed with a particular purpose in mind, versus something more like non-standardized assessments. So teacher-created assessments, teacher-created surveys, where somebody else has sort of put together the data collection tool, but it's not standardized in the same way that an assessment would be. So I wanted to start with validity and score inflation. The concerns or the considerations for validity and score inflation actually tend to be very similar for both standardized and non-standardized assessments. In all cases for validity, we are asking ourselves, do I have strong support for my inferences? And this goes back to the purpose for which this assessment was designed. Even if it was created by a company, a large scale company, for example, in the United States, we have things like the SAT, versus a teacher created test, I would always be asking myself, what was the purpose for which this assessment was designed? And then score inflation, that's what happens when there are incentives. As we were saying before, if there was a high stakes test, whether or not it's standardized or not standardized, we still would be concerned about score inflation if those stakes were really high. And then for the remainder of the terms, when we have standardized assessments, usually there are psychometricians and other people who take great care to make sure that these tests have high reliability, that there's actually low measurement error, at least as it relates to selecting items to measure a concept. And so for reliability and measurement error, it tends to be less of a concern for standardized assessments, but those tend to be more of a concern for those teacher-created assessments or teacher-created surveys. For sample sizes, when you're doing standardized assessments at scale, you have close to or 100% of your student population. You're required to take it, or you sort of sat in a room where everybody has to do it. And so the sample tends to better represent the population versus non-standardized assessments. There might be a bit more variability and they may not represent the total population. So this is just a set of considerations as you think from your position being at the system level of what is different about looking at these terms from a standardized assessment perspective versus non-standardized assessment perspective. And finally, I just want to put in a plug for qualitative data, because that is one of the main things that we talk about in the DataWise book, that there are different considerations when we think about qualitative data, and we don't use the same terms exactly, but we are really thoughtful about, for example, who we are sampling. Are we sampling a large group of students or teachers or employees, and we're trying to represent breadth, or are we focusing on a specific group? Where we're really trying to get in depth about their experiences. If we're doing something like interviews and focus groups, you have to think about the setting that you are asking people to do the interviews in. Are they comfortable? What's convenient? How anonymous do you want them to be? And then in what format do you want them to respond? Is verbal response the best, or is it actually better to maybe get something in writing? And then finally, if you're doing observations, which is another source of qualitative data, what is your choice of settings, and why are you observing in those settings, and are you going to interact with the people in those settings? So for example, as a system leader, you may want to observe PLC or professional learning community or team meetings that your instructional leadership teams or your teacher teams are having, and is your presence as a system leader going to affect the dynamics of that setting, and how might you account for that? So those are some considerations when collecting qualitative data. And through all of this, the point I just want to leave you with is this idea of triangulation. The more that we can triangulate and use what's called multiple measures of the same concept, the better we can draw a more valid inference. So triangulation helps to lower the effect of measurement error. And just pointing out to you that one of the original authors of the first DataWise book, Dan Koretz, points out that we should never make consequential decisions on the basis of a single assessment score or single assessment result. So you're at the system level, you have much more wide variety of scores, but just the single assessment results, we should not make consequential decisions just based on those single data points, because we always need more data to triangulate to help us draw valid inferences.